In this video, we're going to go through the details of building a master detail form with the save as capability. So if I go into my K2 designer, I've called it a little folder here called clone form data. And the artifacts that I have inside here is I've got two smart objects. The one is the header. So if you go in and have a look at that, that's just the name, date, description, and status, which are these details over here. And then I have the items, which are name, quantity, value, and total, with the header ID inside there. So it is these items which refer back to this one over here. So that's that master detail record taking place there. All right. Then what I've simply done is I've just used the auto generate of the header view and the items, and then I've gone and tidied them up a little bit. So let's just go and have a look what I've done first of all. So if you look at the header, let's go to the header item. So that is the view for the top section. Let's go and edit that. Now inside here, it's just the fields, the fields that are sitting inside here. Some of them I've made read-only, like for example, the ID. I've just marked that as a read-only, and the date, and a number of things inside here. I can also mark that as read-only. And I've got a number of rules that I put on here. Now, whenever I build a view, what I normally do is get rid of all the buttons that I don't need. When you auto-generate it, it's going to put all these methods on here. The only one that I want in my example is the save button, and I've actually made that invisible because I don't want people to save this individual item. I want just a single button on the form that they can save the whole master detail record as. For the header as well, I've got a parameter called PID. So what that means is I make this view completely self-managing. So it needs to get if it gets an ID inside of it, it'll know then what to do with it, and that happens in my initialize. So I have a rule here that when the view initializes, if it has been passed in an ID, then it goes and it loads its own data using that ID. So it'll go and do that. Otherwise, if it initializes without a header ID, meaning it's a new record, I go and do some transferring of data, and all I'm doing in this particular case is pre-populating the date with the current date and time. I guess I can even populate the status with draft, but I've already done that as a default field. You can see I've already put draft inside there. Then on the save button, it's simple, just calling the save method. Right, so that's the header item. Let's go and have a look at the data items. So for the data items on this one, what I've done there is just generated a view, and I've used an editable list view. So that's all I've done for that particular one, and then gone and made some modifications to it. So let's go and have a look at that one. So in this one, I'm only including the name, quantity, value, and total columns, so just those ones over there. The header ID I don't include because obviously that's just for the master detail connection. And I've hidden, I haven't included that on the view over here. What I've also done is for my total field, I've just put an expression to take the quantity times the value to give me a total, and I've made that read only. So that's the basics. Again, I also put a parameter, so p header ID that it'll expect, and if it does get that parameter on my initialize, I'm looking that if I've been passed in the header ID, then I will go and get all the items that match that header ID, that parameter that's been passed in. So I don't want to get everything, just the ones for that particular header. And of course inside here I can go and specify certain sorting and things like that, but I've left it pretty straightforward for now. All right, so this view, if it gets a header ID, it'll go and fetch the items for that header ID. Further to that, I've got a little save button inside here. So this is the default save that was generated. But what I've extended that to do is that when it calls the save method, this goes and it looks at all the items that have been added, all the items that have been changed and removed, and calls an appropriate smart object action for each of those. So first of all the items that have been added are going to call the create method. And if I go and configure that, the only change that I've done inside here is that it's going to create these items based upon the smart object data for that row, but I've also told it to use the header ID for the header ID over here. You can see that's my p parameter header ID inside there. So what that'll do is it'll go and create each of those rows using whatever parameter that I've passed in. So as soon as I create the header and get an ID for it, I can then go and pass it into this this editable list view and call the save method, which will then go and create each item using that header ID. The save and the delete methods, you don't need to go and modify those at all. Those all have the right capability just built in there for that, because it's going to go and save and delete based upon the ID. The only other thing that I've added in here is I've added a little button here called clone. Now what happens is, if this data is loaded by a previous smart object call, so if this data already exists, so if we've already got a bunch of fields sitting inside here, and they will already be connected to a specific header, and they each will have their own ID already sitting inside the database. Now what happens is, when I want to clone that, I can't call the same method, the same save method, because some of these items are already there. It's not going to pick up that they're newly added or they're newly changed. I've got to actually go to every item in here and create them as if they're brand new. So on my rule that I've got there, what I'm doing is I'm saying over here for all rows, and this is a new feature in K2, I'm using the for each. So over here, I've got for each item in a list view. So I'm saying for each item that has been changed, added, removed. Well, in this particular case, if you remember, I just want all the items. I don't care if they're already existing or they're new items, because we're doing a clone. It means that we have to do a create for each of those. So I've just said for all the rows, call the smart object. So this time I'm calling the actual smart object and I'm executing its create method, and I'm passing in all these items. I've mapped them to here, and again passing in the header ID inside here. So it's going to call the create method using the header ID and then each item in the editable list. So that is what's going to do the cloning of these items for me. Now what you can do is, for now I've got these buttons as visible. I normally hide these away, because then I call them from my form, and therefore my view has control about its own logic about how it should save and clone and do things like that. All right. So now let's go to the form, or the last view that I've got here is this little header list. What this does is it is based upon the header smart object. So it's based upon this one over here. And what it does is bring me a list of all the items, all the header items. So it is this list over here, just so that I can see a repository of all the items and what their current status is. So that is sitting inside here. Now, what I've done is I've added a couple buttons onto it. I've added a new button. And on this particular view, that new button doesn't do anything. I'm going to use that on the form, that when someone clicks new, I can do something with that. The other thing that I've got on here is a delete button. Now what the delete button needs to do is it can go and delete one of these rows. But if you remember, I don't just want it to delete one of the header rows, I want it to delete all the child items as well. So I've got that built and some logic built in here, which I'll come to a little bit later. So if we go to our form, so let's give us some space. All right, there we go. So on the form, I've got a little header, a header view, which is this little header over here. It loads up my logo and who I am and a bunch of details. Then I've got my header items, which can bring me the list of current headers that we've got. And then I've got some rules now that when I click on one of them, I want to load up the header details and load up its items. So let's have a look at that one first. Here we go. So you'll see there, I've got when list item clicked. Now what I do is when you click on it, I also want to go and show, because I know that you've selected an existing record, I'm going to show the save button, and I'm going to also show the save as new, because it's an existing record. In an existing record, you can save it or you could save it as new. You'll notice that my save as new by default is actually invisible. All right. So let's go and have a look at that rule. If I go to the save as new, sorry, when the item is clicked, let's check that out. So what I'm doing over here is the first thing I do is I call the initialize method of my header item. The reason I don't call the load method, and even though there is a load method that sits inside here, that would require me doing all the mapping on the form level. But if you remember, my header item, I added that parameter, that if it gets passed in a parameter, it knows what to do. So that's exactly what I'm doing here. I call in the initialize. and I pass in to that header item the ID of the currently selected header ID in the list. So that I just dragged into there, and that's all I need to do. And then that view knows how to take care of itself. It knows how to load its data. The same thing for the editable list items. So for the child items, just in the same way, that particular view needs a header ID. See, and that again I just got from the header list, the same ID as the previous one. Just pass that inside there, and that means these two views sort of initialize themselves. Then I'm changing the properties of the save button, and what I'm doing there is I'm just changing the text to the word save, because I can change that wording to the word create when it's a new record to be created, otherwise save. And then I'm also showing the save as new form control, which shows that button at the bottom there. All right, so that's going to show the save as new button, and it's going to have loaded up all of this data. So then this record is visible. Obviously the normal save button is quite straightforward. What that button does is it calls the save button on my header. If you remember, there was already a save button that sits inside there. Then I transfer some data. So what I'm doing is I'm getting the newly created ID out of the header. It's a new ID that is created here, and I'm passing that in to my editable list header ID. So I pass that into there, so that my editable list items, so the child items, know, when they get their save button is called, they know exactly which ones, which header to relate it to. Then I'm just showing a little message saying thank you, and then I'm refreshing the header list. So I'm refreshing this list at the top here. So after you've done a save, it refreshes, so it'll show any changes. So just call the list refresh. Okay, so for the actual cloning or the saving as new, very, very similar. In this particular one, first of all, what I'm doing is I need to clear out the ID of the header so that it thinks it's the new one. So you'll see over here, I'm transferring some data, and what I'm doing is I'm just clearing out the header items parameters that would have been passed in when it was loaded up for the first time. So I'm just clearing those out, so it thinks it's going to be a new record. Then I call the save, then I do the transfer of data like I did before, because this is going to generate a new ID, which I then transfer into my editable list items. And then I call the clone method I call the clone method rather than the save method of the items. So it knows, doesn't care whether they're added or new or whatever the items are, where they come from. It's just going to go and do a create all for each of those using the header ID that was passed in. Then it does the list refresh for the header, and therefore we have the new item that has just been created. Right, so that's a straightforward sort of, loading up items, being able to modify them and then save them as new, and effectively refreshing the header with a new item sitting inside there. So let me go back to this delete over here. So what this delete does, let's go and edit that view. I wanted to make this view completely independent, that it doesn't need to have the child items to know how to do a delete. So on the delete, what it's going to do is it's going to look at the currently selected list item, and it's going to populate this little list display with all the child items. So what it is a little list display connected to a smart object that is pointing to the items. When you hit the delete button, it's going to go and populate that, and then I'm going to do a for each and delete all the items. So let's have a look at that. So the first thing I do is I populate that list display with items. So that little list display over here, I'm populating it, but I'm telling it to only get the items that match the header ID of the selected item in the list. So that goes and it populates that list, so I get a list of all the items that are sitting inside there. Then I'm using the for each method again, that's inside there under the conditions. So I'm saying for each item that is returned in that list control, call the delete method, and I'm passing in the ID. So that ID comes from the list controls items that we're busy looping through. So we're busy looping through these items. I'm passing in that ID into the SmartObjects delete method and deleting each of those items. Then after that, we then delete the actual header record. So then I just pass in the ID into the header record. So that is the ID of the header item inside there, to that SmartObjects method delete method, which deletes the header. And then I call the list refresh to refresh the display. So independently, this little view over here can manage deleting the header items as well as the child items if your backend system isn't taking care of that referential integrity.